Rising living costs trigger violent protests in Sierra Leone. Demonstrators want the president to resign. How should the government respond? And could record high fuel and food prices spark social unrest elsewhere in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Calm has returned to Sierra Leone following rare violent protests. At least 21 demonstrators and 6 police officers have been killed. The government has imposed a nationwide curfew. Hundreds of people, angry at the rising cost of living, rallied on Wednesday in the capital, Freetown, and in the north of the country. Demonstrations soon turned violent, with some calling for President Julius Maada Bio to resign. Police have been accused of using excessive force. The president says the unrest is terrorism instigated by Sierra Leoneans living abroad. The internet was cut on Wednesday and Thursday, and the government says it is monitoring social media for information that could destabilise the state.
One, we do not have freedom of speech, and two, there's no respect for us, the women, and our economy is down, and the cost of living are very high. Because of it, we're suffering.
The profit we're supposed to have is just not there anymore. Our husbands are not working. We're the ones paying the rent and taking care of home. We have 3 to 4 children to feed, and even that is something we can't afford. 36 cents used to be enough to buy lunch for our children. Even if we have double that now, it's no longer enough. That's exactly why we're asking the government to reduce prices on all commodities, because the high cost of living here is making us suffer too much.
Ahmed Idris, our correspondent, is in Freetown with this report.
On a regular day, the streets of Freetown will be choked with human and vehicular traffic. Now, that traffic is scanty on the streets of this once vibrant city. And this has to do with the uncertainties surrounding the situation on the ground. A lot of people don't feel safe enough to come onto the streets. Shops that are supposed to have fully reopened, a lot of these traders are staying home, not opening their shops, fearing that things could erupt once again and cost them losses. Now, the government has stepped in trying to reduce the cost of petrol, especially at petrol stations. However, to make the situation worse for people, some of these petrol stations are refusing to open and sell to members of the public. And that means that there will be shortages, and when shortages are there, the cost of transportation will go up because the black market will thrive. Now, apart from that, people are complaining that they don't have enough to eat. They don't have the resources, the opportunities, and the money to put food on the table for members of their families. Now, this is a country, we all remember, that has not fully recovered from the crisis of the past years, the Ebola crisis, the civil war, and then the challenges of the global food supply chain. This is a country that is dependent on import, even food. A lot of it has to be imported for members of the public or people here in Sierra Leone. Now, that is coming at a very, very high prices, which the government doesn't have the money to do that. Even the most richest of countries in Africa are really struggling to address these challenges. Now, a lot of people are watching closely to see what happens in the next few days, whether the government will try to address these issues. But the biggest problem is the rising cost of living across Sierra Leone. Ahmed Idris for Inside Story.
Sierra Leone had been relatively stable since the end of an 11-year civil war in 2002. The UN estimates at least 70,000 people were killed and more than 2.6 million, or half of the population, displaced in one of the bloodiest conflicts in Africa. Today, the West African nation faces different problems. It ranks near the bottom of the Global Hunger Index and the UN's Human Development Index, a benchmark of prosperity. And that's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. The African Development Fund recently approved a $2 million grant to boost food production. The World Bank has revised down economic growth projections from 6% to just 3.6%. Well, let's bring in our guests today. And joining us via Skype from Abuja in Nigeria is Obigwe Egwegu. He's a policy analyst at the consultancy development Reimagined. Marcella Sesay is an executive director at the Campaign for Good Governance in Sierra Leone. She joins us from Nairobi. And also on Skype from London is Ken Ife. He's a development economist and lead consultant to the ECOWAS Commission. A very warm welcome to each of you. Thanks for joining us here on Inside Story. Marcella, if we could start with you. Sierra Leoneans have enjoyed many years of relatively peaceful living since the Civil War. How surprised are you by Wednesday's violence?
Truly and honestly surprised. It was painful and disturbing to watch the tragic videos on social media. But I must say, and I must say to the entire world, that is not Sierra Leone, because we all have agreed that never again will we settle our scores through violence. We have agreed through the Truth and Reconciliation mechanism. And for 20 years, our democratic trajectory has followed a path of peace consolidation and working honestly towards reconstruction. We have agreed that we would speak through the ballot box. So that degree of violence meted out by angry protesters is not Sierra Leone. And I think that is why my institution, Campaign for Good Governance, condemns that sort of violence in its strongest terms. But whilst we say that, we believe strongly that citizens have a right to express their views and opinions about government. But because of our conflict past, we have always promoted non-conflictual means of engagement.
Ovigwe, why do you think we did see such violent confrontations between both the protesters and the police?
Well, if we look at Sierra Leone's arc and coming from a 10-year civil war between 1991 and 2001, I think, you would see that there is a lot of there's a lot of reason to be very cautious whenever there is hostility among the public, because things can get really out of control very fast. And if you even look at the figures coming out in just a short period of time, over 36 people, were already killed. That is not the norm when you look at in other countries, for instance, like Ghana, where there was some protests earlier in the year, and even Senegal lead up to the elections. You have to be very cautious of that, and that is why, to some extent, I would support the government's effort to quickly step in and put out a curfew, zero tolerance, to the protests, because, like I said, the fragility and the low trust level within Sierra Leone is still very high because of the traumas of the civil war. So from that perspective is why I would say the security forces had to step in the way they did. Was it the best approach they took? I don't think so. But given that past, efforts and measures needed to be taken at the spot from the very beginning to ensure that this does not spiral out of control.
Sure. Ken, what do you make of the security forces' response?
Well, I think I would like to associate myself with the comments made by my colleagues to the fact that peaceful resolution and conflict resolution are just the way to go, especially when you have that history of civil war. You just ignite old wounds, and things will rapidly get out of control. But Sierra Leone is a very, very dynamic entrepreneurial economy, and we're so proud of that country as a member of ECOWAS. We know that they have had a fair share of conflicts and disruptions, supply chain disruptions and health hazards. It's not just the civil war. They went through Ebola, from there to COVID-19, and now to Russian conflict-induced food shortages and petrol prices. So this is universal. Everybody's going through this pain. And I think they ought to take a step backwards. There's a lot of help coming. African Development Bank is giving some help. World Bank is giving some help, and we stand to support them. But they shouldn't break up in the face of this adversity.
Ovigwe suggested that the curfew is a good idea to let passions on both sides calm down. Ken, do you agree with that?
Oh, no, definitely. They have to have, in this flash, this is political violence and social upheaval. You have to have coffee to prevent more lives being lost. And our heart goes out to the families that have lost their loved ones.
But Marcella, we've got a curfew in place. We know that it's very difficult to get in touch with people from the outside, inside Sierra Leone. There have been communication blackouts, the internet's been cut. There's a bit of a vacuum happening right now, isn't there? Do we expect the government to come forward? Do we expect the government to address the nation? Do we need to hear from the president right now?
Absolutely. In fact, what we are pushing for right now is to ensure that the vacuum, the information vacuum is filled. Citizens want to really hear from the leaders. We have urged in several places for dialogue with groups, young people. Sierra Leoneans must understand that, yes, the social and economic situation are real, but the challenges that we face in our country, violence is not the option. So we want political leaders to ensure that we take away the violent communication and we fill that in with citizens' engagement, because there's currently a communication deficit. And unfortunately, that has been filled by an information, violent information, especially coming from the diaspora, using audios and videos of incitement. And it is that void that we are calling government to use communication persons within their ranks to feel and to talk to citizens and to engage them, to communicate their plans. What is it that government has for us in this nick of time of economic challenges? Whilst I say that democratic realities have been the hallmark of the way we do politics in Sierra Leone, we have not been able to translate democracy into real economic dividends for citizens. So government must be able to take charge now. Citizens want to listen, to His Excellency the President. We have also encouraged that His Excellency the President be a father figure to us now and speak to us. The youths are really exploited. So what's happening is that whilst we do all of this, our political leaders, there is a polarization and intolerance of politics in Sierra Leone. The nation is grossly divided along political lines. The two lead political parties in the country must be seen to be speaking to people. And this gross intolerance to communicate, especially when we are coming to the elections. What is it in their manifesto? They should be able to give the citizens hope instead of distress.
OK, Ovigwe, what role does the diaspora play in Sierra Leone? Because we've had the president, Julius Maada Bio, saying that they are responsible, Sierra Leoneans outside of the country are responsible largely for this violence, which he calls acts of terrorism. He seems to suggest that there's a more sinister element to these protests, that these are people outside the country trying to overthrow him. Is this correct, or is this a paranoid way of approaching this issue?
So one of the things you have to look with African countries is that they tend to have very complicated relationships with the diaspora, right? Because many of the people who might emigrate from their home countries are doing so because of they want better life, they want a more decent environment, right? So when the memories they have of their countries are often not very good compared to where they currently are, and that usually plays into how they interpret dynamics within the country. However, if you look at the figures with regards to Sierra Leone right now, it's still not very encouraging. For instance, the life expectancy is 34 years. Maternal mortality is 2,000 deaths per 100,000 babies born, and Sierra Leone is seventh worst performing country by HDI. So these figures, they actually mean something on the ground in terms of what people, when they speak to their relatives and friends who they left at home, they would, of course, always complain about these issues, that I'm speaking about. And then because these diaspora populations tend to have the means, not just the means, but also, like I said, a sense of memory that is maybe a little bit divorced from reality, but also still very much related, they tend to then use their power and their voice to amplify problems around development and poor economic performance in a country. However, I will always emphasize that it is very irresponsible for people who do not live in a country to call for regime change or for to break down of law and order, because you don't live there anymore. You are not going to be on the front lines when things get really messy. And that's what we are seeing today. Those who have called for protest and uprising, yes, it's fine, but knowing fully well that things can really escalate out of control, one have to be very, very cautious, because now the 36 people who have died, none of them is in the diaspora. Meanwhile, all those who have been calling for protests, they are very safe in their homes. So while we want to take political action to call for good governance and all of these issues, the local context has to be very, very crucial. And I think the Sierra Leone diaspora needs to be very careful when they are making their demands and what solutions and methods they are pushing.
So, Ken, from your position there in London, what do you see the role of diaspora being in these particular protests?
Well, I think this is not a time for trading blames or accusations. I think the government has to open all communication channels and be a lot more inclusive, because the diaspora can be a strategic asset. I can tell you this. We have to build bridges with them. We have to, have a diaspora commission that reaches out to them, have diaspora investment bond, have more creative and energetic relationship that then mutually, so that they can be much more helpful. Because in this day of social media, if they choose mischief, they could play it to the extreme. And that's not what we want. We want to get them as stakeholders in building and rebuilding the economy. And they can play a very significant role. Because I know, for example, in Nigeria, some years ago, they used to bring $28 and $26 billion to the economy by remittance. And there are a lot of Sierra Leoneans abroad who should be minded to think in the same way and contribute much more positive. But it all depends on how government reaches out at them. You have to have positive policy and engagement, even to the point of looking at electoral laws that allow them to vote, all kinds of measures to reach out. These are our people. And they could contribute more to the development and peace and prosperity of the nation. And as I said, they have a highly entrepreneurial population, because I did the policy framework for private sector development in West Africa and MSME strategy and all of that. And I know that even at the point I was developing the policy, they took away and ran away and started implementing them in Sierra Leone. Even before the policies were ready, they already ran into production. MSMEs and startups, Sierra Leone is well ahead. They're spending more, they do it, opening channels, digital funding channels for MSMEs, so they can, but there are a lot of challenges. But they need cooperation.
So, Marcella, just to jump in there, because this is a country that's got a lot to give and it's got a very dynamic population. Why is it facing such a dire economic situation?
So it's very important. I mentioned earlier on, it's about how do we mobilize diverse interests into the economic trajectory of our country. So the youth bulge is real. The youth are there. The population has increased. Over 80% of our population are young people. We need to look at what they need. Unemployment is real. How do we translate their aspirations into real dividend? And that is exactly what we want to see as a country. We need to address the youth factor, because the situation is that they are a readily available resource for violence. And so government must make that a priority so that the young people would understand that there are programs in place, innovative ways, because the world is now connected. It would interest you that the youth would not have money, but they will have for food, but they will have money to buy data and listen to what's happening around the world. They will have money to buy data and listen to incitement. So government must ensure that the youth factor becomes a priority and design programs for them, targeted programs that they would aspire to, and for them to feel part of the society.
Ken, protests over living costs such as these, when people have got very little left to lose, they tend to have a habit of gaining momentum and spreading. What is your concern that they might spread across the region, out of Sierra Leone to other countries in West Africa?
Well, every country in West Africa have their own challenges. At least insecurity is by far the greatest challenge we face in the region. And I know that it's not going to be the same as in North Africa when we had the Arab Spring. We're not going to have that type in West Africa because that's a different ball game. But the insecurity is far more pervasive in the region. That's more the type of the social upheaval that I expect. But having said that, all governments have to work really hard, flat out, to stop the situation that is degenerating. And I think this is just a tip of the iceberg.
Okay. And Ovigwe, your response to the challenges that Sierra Leone particularly is facing. We heard Marcella saying that the youth need to be engaged, that they are a critical resource, and they also need to be prevented from being tempted towards violence. What do you think the government needs to do?
Create jobs, because it is unemployment that can prevent a demographic boom from becoming demographic doom. And many African countries, in fact, the African region as a whole, will be 2.4 billion people by 2050. 2050 is less than 30 years away, right? So if we do not find a way to ensure that these new citizens coming up will get jobs, even current citizens will get jobs, access to upward progression, then it's going to be very difficult to keep the security situation even stable, not talk of making it better. And right now, if you look at Sierra Leone's economic structure, like many African countries, it is a commodity exporter. Titanium being the highest, and then you have wood and aluminium ore. Why we're not creating enough jobs is because we've remained, or many countries have remained as commodity exporters and have not gone into value addition. Because for instance, if you want to add value to maybe wood, for instance, turn into furniture to export, or even process the aluminium ore and all of that, of course, you're going to create an entire value chain. And the value chain is going to requires a lot of manpower to operate. So the issue of just peace building or dialogue and engagement with youth, that is just the primary, or let's say the very immediate step. If people are pacified today by engagement and the promises of better lives, and you do not deliver that in not so distant future, they are going to take to the streets again and take up arms, and this might be worse. And that is why
Marcella,
I think we
just
need
to jump in there, because it's a
employment.
very difficult global climate to create jobs. Do you think this particular government is able to do that?
We should be able to look at homegrown initiatives. My colleague just talked about how do we do value addition. Sierra Leone is a very fertile ground for innovation and creativity, and we must look inwards to see that youth are fully engaged and to make sure that investments are made in agriculture, for example. The youth unemployment is critical concern, and the economic realities they face on a daily basis is real. We should not turn a blind eye to that. And so if we look inwards and look at homegrown initiatives to make sure that investment in what we have in country, and to make sure that Sierra Leoneans are able to be geared towards, a psychological developmental change to feed ourselves.
Okay, just in the last 30 seconds we've got left, Ken, are you optimistic that this president, this current government in Sierra Leone can weather and manage this crisis?
Of course I am. If you look at Sierra Leone is an essentially agrarian economy, because the agricultural component of their GDP is about 58% to 60%. Unfortunately, the industry side is only about 12%, and the service sector 30%. That's actually the reverse compared to the whole average across the West Africa. It should be 58% for industry, 54%, then 20% for agriculture, and then about 20% double for value addition industry. So my colleague is right. We have to focus on value addition. But let me tell you something. There are some countries within the region there that have actually poured in money in converting subsistence agricultural farmers to commercial farmers, getting about 5 million farmers access loan with no collateral. So I
Okay.
think they need to be looking in that direction. So get more youth into agriculture, but with loan with no collateral, and then push value addition,
Okay.
and that will really put pressure on
I do like
unemployment.
to end on an optimistic note, so we will leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, all our guests today, Obigwe Egwegu, Marcella Samba Sesay, and Ken Ife. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.